Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Connor Mercer, and this is Connor Collects. I discuss the history of gaming, my thoughts on said history, and my experiences collecting video games. Today, we'll be going back to the early days, specifically the Cold War. The year is 1962. Tensions between the US and the Soviets are boiling hot. At the same time, many are fascinated with the rise of new technologies such as spaceflight. It didn't take long for these two worlds to collide. Programmers at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology devised a game of two ships in space orbiting a star. The two ships are engaged in a space war, trying to take down the other with space torpedoes. Steve Russell's Space War was an instant hit at MIT, although it took a few years before it became a well-known classic, as this was during a time when the global programming community was still only a drop in the bucket compared to what it is today. Space War isn't actually the first video game. Nobody really knows what is. Many people point to 1958's Tennis for Two as being the first digital, entertainment-focused video game. Tennis for Two was not sold in stores, of course, but it was showcased at the Brookhaven National Lab public exhibit. Many games during this time period were simple demonstrations of what the computer could do. They were never intended to be sold, as these computers were so expensive and so large that they were only used by government facilities and large businesses. As more and more games were made, many realized the potential for coin-operated variants, and soon they were being shipped to arcades. You wouldn't think so immediately, but arcades were actually well established by this point. You could go for skee-ball or pinball. Adding video games seemed like a no-brainer to many. In 1972, an Atari employee built the first prototype for Pong, a tennis game featuring two paddles and a ball. The prototype was sent to a local bar to see if it was commercially feasible. They realized it was when they went back to fix the machine and realized it wasn't broken, it was literally overflowing with quarters. Meanwhile, a company called Magnavox had just released the first home video game console, the Odyssey. It was a modest success. If you're listening to this, you probably know what a video game console is, but just in case, I'll summarize. A video game console is a box specifically designed for playing video games and pretty much nothing else. It usually features a slot for the game itself, such as a cartridge or a disc, and a controller. It plugs directly into your TV. A computer, on the other hand, is an all-purpose device that can do much more than just play video games. They're usually more expensive, and sometimes the computer itself is built into the screen. If you've used an iMac, you probably know what I'm talking about. In 1972, home computers hadn't taken off yet, and because the Magnavox Odyssey was the first console of its kind, it was basically uncontested. The arcades were a different story. They continued to rise in popularity, especially after releases such as 1978's Space Invaders, 1980's Pac-Man, and 1981's Donkey Kong. Around this time, home video games were spiking in popularity. There was no longer one option, there were several. The most famous home console of this time was the Atari 2600, released in 1977. While the best-selling games were initially arcade ports, Atari proved the feasibility of a long-term home console with its own unique library of games released over several years. Atari's competitors faced a stiff challenge. The two other relatively successful platforms were the Mattel Intellivision and the ColecoVision. They were moderately successful, but by the time the dust had settled, Atari had sold 30 million 2600s, and Mattel and Coleco had only sold 5 million combined. The Atari 2600 is actually still on the list of the most successful home consoles. It actually sold more than the original Xbox from 2001. At the start, games had wild and fantastical art on the box to represent the idea of what the game was. You didn't actually see screenshots of actual gameplay. And since this was the early days when all they had was pixel graphics, you were generally betting whatever money you had that hopefully this game was good. If the game sucked, you had no way of knowing until you put the cartridge in and played it. Or if you were lucky, you had a friend who actually had a copy and an opinion. With the rise of the Atari and others, the gaming market expanded way too rapidly. Games and consoles were being churned out like fast food, and there were too many. One thing that happened fairly early was the start of the third-party developer. Essentially, at the very start, the only companies making home console games were the companies who were making the consoles. Atari made Atari games, Mattel made Intellivision games. That all changed in 1979 when a group of pissed off Atari employees got up and left. Game developers were not credited with their games, and they didn't get a whole lot of money either. Some of these games were making millions and millions of dollars in sales, but all the developers were getting was their standard salary. This group of ex-Atari developers immediately founded Activision. With their intimate knowledge of the 2600's hardware, they were able to continue to make stellar games, and Activision was a hit. Most of you know the name, and yes, they are the same Activision around today. Activision was a major blow to Atari in two ways. The first was the immediate loss of quite possibly their best and brightest. These ex-Atari men were responsible for some of Atari's best sellers. The second and less immediately obvious thing was the notion that you didn't need to be Atari to make Atari games. Once Activision achieved success, dozens of other third-party studios began to sprout up. Many of these companies weren't actually good. That brings us to our next point. More and more games being made by more and more people meant more and more crap being shoveled out at unsustainable rates. As a matter of fact, a decade from now, in the 1990s, they will coin the term shovelware. Lots of this shovelware actually came from the big dogs themselves. In 1982, an Atari employee was tasked with the impossible: make an E.T. movie tie-in game in 5 weeks, in time for the Christmas season. When I say an Atari employee, I mean one guy. Call it what you will. A miracle? An act of God? Skill? Luck? Some or all of these things caused E.T., the extraterrestrial, exclusively for the Atari 2600 to ship on time in December 1982. There was one problem, however, and it was simple. The game sucked. I'm not going to say that E.T. killed the video game industry. I'm not even going to say it was the straw that broke the camel's back. I am, however, going to say that by 1983, the American console video game market had begun to collapse. Now, I specifically say American and console because A, the market in Europe was still forming and the Japanese market was basically unaffected, and B, home computer games were kicking off almost stronger than ever. In 1982, computer manufacturer Commodore released their Commodore 64 machine. It was named for its shockingly large 64 kilobytes of RAM. And for reference, the budget model iPhone SE3 has 62,000 times more than that. The Commodore 64 was an instant success, allowing the average Joes of America to digitally do their taxes and make digital spreadsheets, and allowing the sons of the average Joes of America to play video games on their parents' workstations. No game console required. As the home console market crashed down on itself, the home computer market held a moderately successful stride. To end off this segment, I'll let you in on a little secret. In 1982, Atari's revenue was $3.2 billion with a B. By 1985, it had dropped 97% to $100 million. Off the top of my head, no industry on the planet has seen that kind of disaster ever. Now, the other segment on my show, obviously named Connor Collects, involves me discussing my embarrassingly large collection of video games. Most of my stuff, amusingly, is from after the video game market crash. Spoiler alert, they survived. But I do have a few things from the era. Video game consoles are generally split into generations. These days, they last about 8 years long, maybe a little less. Between the release of the Odyssey in 1972 and the market crash in 1983, there were 2 console generations. The Atari 2600 started the second. I don't actually have anything from the first generation, but I've got more than a few little trinkets from the second. In 1977, my dad bought the Atari 2600. I know it's 1977 because they released several models of the 2600 with different bells and whistles, specifically switches on the front and different box designs. And because my dad kept basically everything, we can narrow it down to the earliest possible release. Because games were, and are, so expensive, all he had was the Atari and 1 or 2 games. The pack-in was a game called Combat. It had a deep red box and illustrations of war machines firing at each other. It was cool in the 70s and it's cool now. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Anyway, it was included with the system, and you and a friend can shoot at each other with planes or tanks. Another game my dad had in 1977 was called Video Olympics. It was essentially Atari's home console port of Pong with a few variations. It came in a bright yellow box and prominently featured hockey, as that was one of the Pong variants included. He stopped buying games for a while, and I know this because every other Atari game he has still has their price tags on them. $3 per game. I know without a shred of doubt in my mind that he got all of these no earlier than 1983. Some of the price tag stickers say Odd Lot on them, and when I asked my dad, he said he actually remembered going fairly often to Odd Lot in the 80s. My dad took unbelievably good care of his games, and it's still shocking to me that he kept them for so long in such good shape. If you're unaware, games were shipped in literal cardboard until they started to phase in CD cases in the 90s and DVD cases in the 2000s. When we get to the Game Boy Advance a few episodes down the line, I'll tell you all about how my dad would hide the boxes from us, give us only the cartridge when we wanted to play, and then take it back when we were done. I would have been in preschool or kindergarten, and God knows if I had the luxury of keeping those myself, they'd have been destroyed a decade ago. Back to Atari. When my dad first showed me his collection practically untouched since the 80s, I was probably around 10. It was so old that we didn't have the cables to use it properly. There was some sort of cable box adapter that didn't really work at all. So when we played it, my dad had to physically hold two different cables together in a precise spot on the adapter, and I could play for about 5 minutes before he got tired of holding it. Frankly, if you've played anything made after 1990, you're only going to get about 5 minutes of enjoyment from an Atari anyway, unless you're really trying to perfect your score. These days, I like to go to local retro game stores to get my fix. I usually buy relatively newer Nintendo stuff, but once in a blue moon, I'll grab an Atari cartridge. These days, Dad's 2600 is plugged into our old TV upstairs, with correct cables this time, and still works like a charm. Believe it or not, Nintendo actually made a few games for the Atari 2600. I'll discuss Nintendo in more depth in the next episode, but for now, all you need to know is this. In the early 1980s, they went from being a fantastic arcade developer to making home console ports of their arcade games for Atari, Mattel, and Coleco, and eventually making their own successful home consoles after the '83 crash. In 1981, they released Donkey Kong, the game we all know and love. Not long after, they made ports for the Atari 2600 in television and ColecoVision with varying degrees of quality. I actually have a 2600 copy of Donkey Kong, and it's actually not terrible. I'd never recommend it, but it's a neat novelty, and for what it's worth, it functions. Donkey Kong himself looks like a stick figure, but Mario honestly looks pretty decent. In 1983, Nintendo made Mario Bros. For arcades, and of course, almost immediately ported it to home consoles. If you can imagine, I also have the 2600 port of Mario Bros., and it's a bit rougher around the edges. It's still playable and arguably recognizable, but I haven't touched it since I bought it for the first time. In contrast, I go back to Donkey Kong 2600 every so often when I'm bored. Enough about Atari, let's talk about computers. I mentioned the Commodore 64, which is one of the best-selling single computer models ever produced, but I did not mention the lesser-known Texas Instruments TI-99 4A machine. The only reason I'm mentioning it now is because I have it. You may be wondering, why did this schmuck get a TI-99 when all the cool kids have Commodores? The answer is simple. I felt like it. In all seriousness, I have a TI-99 because I have just a little bit more knowledge on how to program for it. Remember in high school when you had to buy those really expensive calculators and you were pissed at how expensive they were until you realized people online were making games for them? And all of a sudden, math class sucked a little less. I can pinpoint with a 99% degree of accuracy that you probably had a Texas Instruments calculator, specifically either a TI-83 or a TI-84. These were so much more than just calculators. They had a rudimentary form of BASIC. BASIC is one of the world's oldest computer programming languages. In high school, when I was bored, I taught myself Texas Instruments' dialect of BASIC. Because of this specifically, when I was looking into old computers and it was down to the Commodore or the TI, I picked the TI-99. Unfortunately, the dialect of BASIC on the 99 is so much older than the dialect on modern calculators that I essentially had to relearn it from scratch anyway. One cool thing about old computers is the storage. Your phone or laptop probably has some sort of internal storage. Literally, the spot inside your machine that holds your data. Back in the day, that was expensive. Early home computers didn't have any internal storage. If you wanted to do taxes or spreadsheets, you had to save it somewhere. How did most people do it? Cassettes. Well, that or just printing the damn spreadsheets. In all seriousness, audio cassettes were a cheap solution. You could plug in a cassette recorder into your computer and literally record data to it in the form of audio. The computer converted the raw data into a form of screeching noise that was saved to a cassette and then later on read that same screeching noise and reinterpreted as the data. I have exactly two accessories for my TI-99, the official Texas Instruments cassette deck and the official Texas Instruments cassette deck cable adapter. I don't have any games, be it cartridge or cassette, and believe me, I'm shocked Nintendo put Donkey Kong on the 99 too. However, using my intricate, extremely limited knowledge of old BASIC and the power of 80s music, I can literally write my own games and save them to a physical format. I've done it. It's not a very good game, but I've done it. Let's loop back around to collecting. I'll probably never get into game collecting for computers because there's just too many of them, and there's just so many compatibility issues these days. Compare that to a video game console. If it says 2600, it plays on the 2600. I don't have to fiddle with downloads or installs. I don't have to look up system requirements. I can just grab a game, say, hey, I have the console that plays this, and buy the game. I've done it. It's extremely satisfying. There are definitely a few Atari games I still want. Believe it or not, I have E.T. They were right to shut down an entire industry over this. It sucks. That being said, I only have the actual game itself, the cartridge. I think it'd be pretty cool to have the actual box that it came in. The question is whether or not I can find one because Atari buried them all. True story. They had so many unsold copies that they literally buried them in the New Mexico desert. Games I want that I actually don't have would probably be Adventure and Pitfall, both on the 2600. Adventure was the first action-adventure game, naturally, and starred you, the player, trying to return the castle's enchanted chalice. It's the only Atari game I can see myself playing for an extended period of time as you actually have to search the game's map to find keys and entrances. Pitfall is the first majorly successful platformer game akin to Super Mario. Obviously, I'm a huge Mario guy, so anything even remotely similar would be cool to have on the Atari. Ladies and gentlemen, that's all for today's episode of Connor Collects. Next time on the show, I'll go way more in-depth on Nintendo, including their early arcade games, which I've essentially glossed over today. I will also be discussing Nintendo's role in saving the American game industry after the market crash of 1983. Along with Nintendo comes new competitors, which means I'll also be going in depth about newcomer Sega and their legendary feud with Nintendo in the early 1990s. Thank you all so much for tuning in, and please be sure to rate and subscribe if you want more. Have a good one.